The sound of the excavator crushing the old timbers sounded like a slap to the memory of a lifetime. They called it a necessary act for the common good, while each fragment on the ground was a memory crushed mercilessly. She smiled amid the ruins, believing that power allowed her to trample on everything. But what she didn't expect was that this land had never belonged to them. And when I pulled out the paper from my pocket, everything began to turn around. I don't need to scream. Justice doesn't come with a whistle. It comes silently and leaves no one in time to react. I am David Martinez, 32, and after years of working, I have saved enough money to buy a piece of lakefront property. The old cabin on Willowbrook Lake seems perfect. The weathered cedar walls have turned a beautiful silvery gray. Meanwhile, Margaret Walsh had moved into the Willowbrook estate 6 months before I bought. A sharp-tongued corporate attorney who had lost her high-paying job in a downsizing and decided to channel her considerable energy and need for control into community improvement. With a perfectly styled bob that never seemed to blow in the wind and an attitude that said, "I went to law school, so I know better than you," she had quickly become HOA president by promising to turn the lake into what she called a resort-quality amenity. The first warning shot came on a Tuesday morning in early spring, a thick certified letter that required my signature and immediately put me on edge. The envelope bore the official Willowbrook Estate HOA seal, and inside was a formal notice citing multiple authentic violations that supposedly threatened community standards and property values. According to Margaret's detailed list, my cabin's natural cedar siding violated the newly instituted earth tone paint requirement. My hand-split rail fence was inadequately maintained and structurally questionable. My gravel driveway created drainage issues affecting community water management, and my wooden dock needed immediate repairs to meet current safety standards. The financial penalty was steep and escalating, $200 per day until all corrections were completed within 10 business days, with the fines doubling each week thereafter. I spent that entire evening at my kitchen table, reading through every page of the HOA covenants with the same methodical attention I'd learned to apply to geological surveys. What I discovered was troubling several contradictions between old and new rules, and a disturbing pattern of restrictions that had been added through emergency amendments and clarification updates after I'd purchased my property. The original covenants from the development's founding were far more lenient and specifically grandfathered existing structures. But somehow new restrictions kept appearing in monthly newsletters disguised as helpful reminders of community standards. Week 2 brought Margaret herself, accompanied by 2 board members carrying official clipboards and expensive cameras with telephoto lenses. They arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning, marching across my property like investigators at a crime scene. Margaret wore a bright red blazer that looked completely out of place in the natural setting, and her black pumps kept sinking into my gravel driveway as she directed her team to photograph everything from multiple angles. They documented my cabin's weathered shingles, the natural stone walkway my grandfather had helped me build, my kayak storage rack, even the bird feeders hanging from my porch eaves. Margaret made elaborate notes about potential environmental hazards and odors affecting community air quality, though my cabin was meticulously maintained and actually smelled like cedar and clean lake air. When I politely stepped outside to ask what they were doing, Margaret's response was swift and cutting. "Mr. Martinez," she said, adjusting her blazer and speaking in the condescending tone she'd probably perfected in corporate boardrooms, "this isn't some rural camping area where anything goes. We have standards here that protect everyone's investment, and your structure simply doesn't meet current community requirements." She gestured dismissively at my cabin as if it were a homeless encampment rather than a lovingly maintained piece of local history. Her board members nodded in agreement, one of them muttering about property values and neighborhood character while taking close-up photos of my hand-carved door frame. By week 3, Margaret had escalated to community-wide character assassination. An email blast went out to all 200 Willowbrook residents with the subject line, "Non-cooperative residents and declining property values." Without naming me directly, it described a shoreline property owner who was selfishly obstructing vital community improvements and forcing his personal aesthetic preferences on hardworking homeowners who deserve better. The email included professionally rendered before and after images showing Margaret's planned lakeside walking path and clubhouse complex, with my cabin digitally erased and replaced by beautiful community amenities that will benefit everyone. She concluded with a call for residents to support your HOA leadership in removing obstacles to progress. The social isolation began immediately and was more painful than I'd expected. Neighbors who'd previously waved and stopped to chat about fishing conditions now crossed the street to avoid conversations. Invitations to community barbecues and holiday parties mysteriously stopped coming. At the grocery store, I overheard Susan Chen telling another resident that some people just don't understand that living in a community means making compromises for the greater good. Even my next-door neighbor, Bill Thompson, who'd always been friendly, started avoiding eye contact when he walked his dog past my property. During this period of mounting social pressure, I began using my professional-grade surveying drone to map the area around my property. Partly this was to document the harassment and changes happening around the lake, but mostly it was because old habits die hard. After 15 years of geological surveys, I was instinctively curious about the land formations and property boundaries that nobody else seemed to understand. The high-resolution aerial footage revealed interesting discrepancies between what the community assumed about property lines and what the actual topography suggested. Week 4 brought serious legal threats designed to intimidate me into submission. The HOA's attorney, a firm from the state capital with an impressive letterhead, sent a cease and desist letter accusing me of unlawfully occupying public waterfront land and demanding I remove my cabin within 48 hours or face immediate litigation for trespassing and property damage. The letter claimed my property boundaries had been incorrectly surveyed during the original sale, and that my cabin sat partially on community land specifically designated for public recreational use. They threatened not only to sue me for damages, but also to pursue criminal charges for willful destruction of community property. When I called Margaret directly to request that the HOA provide official boundary maps and survey documentation to support these serious accusations, her response was typically arrogant and dismissive. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice dripping with false patience, "we don't need to justify our legally sound actions to someone who's clearly in violation of multiple community standards and property laws. Our attorney has thoroughly reviewed the situation with county officials, and frankly, you're trespassing on community property that was always intended for public use." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering if I was losing my mind or if she was really this confident in her completely wrong assumptions. Week 5 marked my decision to fight back with the tools I knew best. I quietly contacted the County Land Registry Office and requested the complete historical survey documentation for my property, dating back to the original land grants from the 1950s. As a professional geological surveyor, I knew how to read these technical documents better than most attorneys, and I wanted to understand exactly what Tom McNeil had sold me and what rights came with the property. The clerk, recognizing my professional credentials, was happy to provide access to the archived survey maps, original deeds, and boundary establishment records that most people never think to request. Meanwhile, I installed a comprehensive security camera system around my cabin's perimeter, positioning the cameras to capture anyone approaching my property from any direction. Margaret immediately filed a complaint with the HOA board and the county sheriff, claiming that my cameras invaded neighbors' privacy and created an atmosphere of surveillance that undermines community trust. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was protesting my surveillance of land she insisted I didn't own, while simultaneously photographing and documenting my every move as evidence for her legal case. A breaking point came during week 6, while I was away on what turned out to be my final work assignment, a 2-day mineral rights survey in the northern part of the state. I'd left on a Wednesday morning, expecting to return Friday evening to my peaceful cabin retreat. Instead, I returned to find my cabin reduced to a pile of splintered wood, twisted metal, and broken glass scattered across the ground where my home had stood for nearly 70 years. Margaret stood in the center of the destruction, like a general surveying a conquered battlefield, directing a cleanup crew with a bulldozer while live-streaming the entire operation on social media. Her video, which I later learned had gone viral with over 50,000 views and hundreds of supportive comments, showed her explaining to her phone camera how the HOA was taking decisive community action to remove unauthorized structures from public waterfront property. She walked through the debris pile, pointing out pieces of my furniture and personal belongings while describing them as evidence of illegal occupation. Comments poured in from viewers praising the HOA's strong leadership, commitment to community standards, and courage to stand up to selfish property owners who think rules don't apply to them. When I pulled into what used to be my driveway and saw the complete destruction, Margaret was posing for photos next to a pile of my grandfather's hand-carved furniture, which had been smashed into kindling by the demolition equipment. She saw me approaching and actually smiled, clearly expecting me to break down or explode in anger. Instead, her casual cruelty crystallized my resolve, "You can sue if you want, Mr. Martinez," she said, brushing sawdust off her red blazer. "But we have better lawyers than you can imagine. And frankly, you should have moved that illegal shack months ago when we first asked nicely." But Margaret had made a crucial tactical error that would ultimately destroy her. By demolishing my cabin, she'd inadvertently made my professional survey work much easier and given me irrefutable evidence of property destruction. Instead of the emotional breakdown she expected, I found myself smiling coldly as I told her, "Thank you for clearing the site, Miss Walsh. This will make the comprehensive land survey much more straightforward." Over the next 3 days, I methodically used professional GPS equipment, ground-penetrating radar, and theodolite measurements to map every inch of my property and the surrounding area with precision that would hold up in any court. Margaret, watching me work with obviously expensive surveying equipment that cost more than most people's cars, probably thought I was having some kind of breakdown or midlife crisis. But several neighbors began gathering to watch me work, asking questions about the sophisticated technology and starting to wonder about my professional background. Dr. Patterson, the retired teacher who lived 2 houses down, commented that she'd never seen such precise equipment outside of major construction projects. "What exactly do you do for work, David?" she asked, and I could see the gears turning as she realized there might be more to this story than Margaret's version. The original 1952 county survey maps revealed a stunning truth that would change everything. The McNeil family had purchased 47 acres in a single transaction, including the entire western shoreline of Willowbrook Lake and extending exactly 200 feet eastward from the high water mark. What the current HOA claimed was public land designated for community use was actually sitting squarely in the middle of my legally purchased property. The developers who built Willowbrook Estate in the 1990s had apparently made assumptions about shoreline access without properly researching the original land grants and boundary establishment records. My demolished cabin hadn't just been sitting on my own land. The entire $2.3 million clubhouse project was being constructed on property I legally owned without my knowledge or consent. Every foundation footing, every utility line, every landscaped walkway was trespassing on my private property. The county surveyor who'd signed off on the original maps was still alive and working, and he confirmed that the boundaries had never been legally changed or transferred to public use. The breakthrough that would seal Margaret's fate came when Tom McNeil heard about the demolition through neighborhood gossip and drove over to see what had happened to his family's legacy. The 78-year-old man stood in my driveway, shaking with fury as he surveyed the destruction. "That cabin was built by my grandfather in 1955, he told me, his voice trembling with emotion and anger. "Every board, every stone in that fireplace, every window frame was crafted by hand. That woman destroyed 70 years of my family's history." Tom had kept meticulous records in his basement, including copies of the original agreement his family had made with the county in 1952, officially recognizing their private ownership of the entire lakeshore and establishing permanent riparian rights. Armed with overwhelming documentation, I hired Sarah Kim, the most successful real estate attorney in our 3-county region, known for winning 15 consecutive land dispute cases against developers, municipalities, and HOA. She said, looking up at me with genuine amazement, "They didn't just illegally demolish your cabin, they're building a multi-million-dollar facility on your private property without permits, without your consent, and without apparently bothering to research who actually owns the land. This isn't just a lawsuit. This is a legal earthquake that's going to reshape how HOAs operate in this county." Our investigation revealed that Margaret had violated numerous HOA procedures and legal requirements in her rush to destroy my cabin and advance her clubhouse project. She'd failed to provide the required 30-day written notice to community members before taking emergency action. She'd never held the mandatory community vote required for expenditures over $50,000. She'd personally signed construction contracts that exceeded her authority under the HOA's own bylaws. Most damaging, she'd made multiple false statements to contractors and county officials about the HOA's legal right to demolish structures and build on the disputed land. For my final strategic move, I requested an emergency HOA meeting to discuss fair compensation for property damage and establish clear boundaries for future community development. Margaret eagerly agreed to host the meeting, confident she could pressure me into accepting a token settlement and signing away any future claims. She had no idea I'd invited the county building inspector, a journalist from the regional newspaper, my attorney, and Tom McNeil to observe the proceedings and provide expert testimony about property rights and construction violations. The Willowbrook Estate Community Center was packed beyond capacity with over 200 residents, my invited expert witnesses, and several people who'd driven from neighboring communities after hearing about the controversy through social media. Margaret put the meeting to order wearing her signature red blazer and an expression of supreme confidence, clearly expecting to control the narrative and emerge victorious. She began with a polished multimedia presentation about her transformative resort community vision, complete with glossy architectural renderings of the nearly completed clubhouse, professional landscape designs, and financial projections showing increased property values for all residents. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret announced, clicking through slides that showed the clubhouse's granite countertops, vaulted ceilings, and lakeside deck, "this $2.3 million investment represents the future of Willowbrook Estate. We're creating amenities that rival exclusive resorts, and every homeowner here will benefit from significantly increased property values." She described my demolished cabin as an unfortunate eyesore that had obstructed progress and community development, framing the demolition as a necessary step toward realizing the community's potential. Margaret's slideshow contrasted professional photographs of my weathered cedar cabin, which she'd apparently been documenting for months, with computer-generated images of families enjoying the new clubhouse facilities. She clicked through renderings showing children playing on the new lakeside playground, couples dining on the clubhouse terrace, and seniors enjoying morning coffee while watching sunrise over the lake. The crowd applauded enthusiastically as Margaret painted herself as a visionary leader who'd overcome obstacles and opposition to deliver unprecedented community amenities. Mr. Martinez bought an old fishing shack and somehow convinced himself he owned rights to our entire shoreline, Margaret declared, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "We've been patient far too long with individuals who put their personal interests above community welfare and property values." She clicked through more slides showing the demolition process, carefully framed as necessary action against an uncooperative property owner who refused multiple opportunities to work with the community. Several residents nodded approvingly as Margaret described her consultations with legal experts and her careful adherence to proper procedures and community standards. Margaret's confidence reached its peak as she concluded her presentation with financial projections showing how the clubhouse would increase every home's value by an average of $50,000. "Sometimes real leadership means making difficult decisions for the greater good," she declared, gesturing toward the demolished cabin site visible through the meeting room windows. "I'm proud that our HOA had the courage to move forward despite opposition from someone who clearly didn't understand community living or property law." When Margaret finally invited me to respond, I calmly walked to the front of the room and opened my laptop, connecting it to the same projection system she'd used for her presentation. "Thank you, Ms. Walsh, for that comprehensive introduction. I've also prepared some visual materials that I think will interest everyone here tonight." The first image I projected was the original 1952 county survey map, with my property boundaries marked in bold red lines that clearly encompass not just my cabin site, but the entire area where the new clubhouse stood. A murmur went through the crowd as residents began to understand the implications of what they were seeing. "This official county survey shows the actual legal boundaries of the property I purchased from Tom McNeil," I explained, using a laser pointer to trace the property lines. "As you can see, my land doesn't just include the cabin site, it extends to include the entire area where the clubhouse is currently under construction." Margaret's confident expression began to falter as she stared at the projection screen, clearly seeing this documentation for the first time. Her face went pale as she realized that every assumption underlying her project might be completely wrong. I methodically presented each piece of evidence, explaining the technical details in language everyone could understand. The certified property deed from the county registrar showed my ownership of 47 acres. Current GPS survey data matched the original maps with surveyor-grade precision. The notarized purchase agreement clearly stated 47 acres, including all waterfront access rights and riparian privileges. Email confirmations from the county building inspector confirmed that the HOA had never obtained proper demolition permits or construction authorization for work on my property. "The cabin you demolished wasn't just legally constructed on my land," I continued, advancing to a slide showing the clubhouse construction site overlaid with property boundary lines. "More importantly, the club you're building is also entirely on my private property, and construction began without my permission, without proper permits, and without any legal authority." The room erupted in shocked murmurs as residents realized they'd been supporting what amounted to trespassing and theft. Margaret tried desperately to interrupt, claiming the documents were fabricated or somehow manipulated, but my attorney Sarah Kim stood up from the audience. I represent Mr. Martinez, and I can assure everyone that every document has been verified by the County Registrar's Office, the State Geological Survey, and independent surveying professionals. We also have County Building Inspector Tom Bradley here tonight to address the permit violations. Inspector Bradley confirmed that the HOA had violated multiple construction codes, demolishing structures without permits, building on property they didn't own, and violating environmental regulations governing lake shores and wetlands. The room fell silent as Tom McNeil slowly stood up, his 78-year-old frame commanding respect from everyone present. "I sold that property to David Martinez last year," he said in a clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of the room. "The family has owned that land since 1952, and every acre, every foot of shoreline, every right and privilege was legally transferred to him. That cabin Margaret destroyed was built by my grandfather's hands, and this HOA had no more right to demolish it than they'd have." Margaret's face went ashen as her own attorney whispered urgently in her ear, loudly enough for nearby residents to hear. "Ms. Walsh, if these property documents are authentic, we could be facing millions in liability for trespassing, destruction of property, and unauthorized construction." The attorney responded coolly, "You never provided accurate survey data or property ownership documentation. We based our advice on your assurances that the HOA owned the disputed land." Residents began asking increasingly pointed and angry questions. Had Margaret independently decided to demolish the cabin without proper board approval? Why hadn't she verified ownership before spending millions on construction? How much community money had been spent on a project that might now be worthless? Who would be financially responsible if the clubhouse had to be demolished? An elderly woman with silver hair stood up, her voice shaking with anger. "We've been completely deceived. Ms. Walsh told us the clubhouse was being built on free community land, but apparently we're trespassing on someone's private property and may have to tear down everything we've built." The mood in the room shifted dramatically as residents realized they'd been manipulated into supporting what amounted to theft, vandalism, and fraud. People who'd enthusiastically supported Margaret's vision now saw her as the source of potential financial disaster. Board members began distancing themselves, claiming they'd relied on Margaret's legal research and trusted her professional judgment. Several residents demanded Margaret's immediate resignation and a complete audit of HOA finances to determine how much money had been spent without proper authorization. Margaret tried desperately to regain control of the meeting, but her authority had evaporated along with her credibility. "This is all a misunderstanding that can be worked out through negotiation," she pleaded, but residents were no longer interested in her explanations. Someone called for an immediate vote of no confidence, and hands shot up throughout the room. The final tally was overwhelming. 187 residents voting for Margaret's removal, with only 13 supporting her continued leadership, mostly people who'd left early or weren't paying attention. I concluded by addressing the entire community with a measured tone that emphasized solutions rather than punishment. "I don't want anyone here to suffer financially because of these mistakes, but I do expect fair compensation for my demolished cabin, immediate cessation of unauthorized construction on my property, and Ms. Walsh's resignation for breach of fiduciary duty and violation of community trust." Margaret Walsh resigned on the spot. Her red blazer wrinkled and her confident demeanor completely shattered. As residents filed out, many approached me with sincere apologies and questions about finding a solution that would work for everyone while protecting their investments. Within 30 days, Margaret faced a cascade of legal and financial consequences that effectively destroyed her life in our community. I filed a civil lawsuit seeking $150,000 in damages for the cabin destruction, emotional distress, and violation of property rights. The county imposed a $50,000 fine on the HOA for construction violations and ordered immediate work stoppage until proper permits could be obtained and property ownership verified. Most devastatingly for Margaret personally, residents filed a class action lawsuit against her individually for exceeding authority, breach of fiduciary duty, and causing financial harm to the community through her unauthorized decisions and failure to perform basic due diligence. The mounting legal bills and potential judgments forced Margaret to sell her Willowbrook home at a significant loss and relocate out of state. Her career as a lawyer was effectively over as the State Bar Association opened an investigation into her conduct and professional competence. Before leaving town, she stopped by my property one final time, her usual arrogance replaced by defeated exhaustion and what might have been genuine remorse. "I really was just trying to build something beautiful for the community," she said quietly, staring at the construction site where her dream clubhouse sat half-finished and legally doomed. My response was measured but firm. Good intentions don't justify illegal methods, and leadership requires understanding the law, not just ignoring it. The resolution ultimately benefited everyone except Margaret and created a stronger, more united community. Working closely with the newly elected HOA board, I helped design a modified development plan that served residents' needs while respecting property rights and legal requirements. The clubhouse was relocated to a genuinely community-owned parcel on the eastern side of the lake, smaller in scale than Margaret's grandiose vision, but still attractive, functional, and legally sound. I granted the community a permanent easement for 1/3 of my shoreline to create the lakeside walking path residents had wanted, while maintaining privacy and exclusive access to the remaining waterfront. In place of my demolished cabin, I built a beautiful modern lodge-style home that complemented the natural setting while clearly establishing my presence and investment in the property. The new house featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, a wraparound deck perfect for morning coffee, and a design that honored the original cabin's rustic spirit while meeting contemporary standards for comfort and efficiency. The community elected me as the new HOA president, and I implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future abuses of power and protect residents' rights. The HOA bylaws were completely rewritten for clarity and transparency, requiring public votes on. We established a property rights committee with rotating membership to review all proposed changes and ensure legal compliance. 1 year later, I stood on my new wooden dock at sunset, watching neighboring families enjoy the collaborative fishing areas and walking paths we'd developed together. My modern cabin blended beautifully with the landscape, proving that thoughtful development and environmental preservation could coexist when guided by mutual respect and legal compliance. Tom McNeil visited regularly with his great-grandchildren, delighted to see his family's legacy honored and preserved, rather than destroyed by ignorance and arrogance. The transformation of Willowbrook Estate became a widely cited example of how knowledge, patience, and proper legal procedures can triumph over bullying, abuse of power, and institutional arrogance. I eventually wrote a detailed account of the experience that was shared thousands of times on social media and referenced in property law courses at several universities. The central message was simple but powerful. When someone claims to break the law for the greater good, they usually mean their own good. And the only real protection for everyone is insisting that all of us, especially those in positions of authority, follow the same rules. Margaret's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming authority without understanding responsibility. She eventually found work as a real estate attorney, specializing in property boundary research, apparently having learned the hard way about the importance of checking survey maps before offering legal advice. Meanwhile, Willowbrook Lake became a model of successful community cooperation, regularly hosting visits from other HOAs seeking to learn from our collaborative approach to balancing individual rights with collective interests.